Well, welcome to day 2 of BERA's annual conference, our first ever fully digital conference, and it's already bringing exciting discussions and debates. Thank you so much for those who were on Twitter about day 1. I managed to read as many as I could towards the end of the day. Some lovely comments, so thanks very much. My own today is a special day for me because it's my second day in the office in more than 18 months. So here I am at the IOE, and I got rained on in my cycle ride, I'm afraid, but never mind. The most important thing about today for me is to welcome Professor Iram Siraj. And it's just such a privilege to have Iram here to speak to us today. She has an extraordinary track record and reputation in education research, and particularly related to early years. Her biography is extensive and full of wonderful things, only a few of which I can draw attention to today. But she has an international reputation for longitudinal research and policy expertise, and she's co-directed a number of influential studies. Perhaps for many of us, the most memorable being the effective provision of preschool, primary and secondary education, the EPPSE studies. But she's also had wonderful, rich and important experience in Australia and a whole range of projects building on her work there. She's one of the things that I particularly welcomed was Iram's book, Social Class and Educational Inequality, the Role of Parents and Schools, published by Cambridge University Press in 2015. Indeed, an award-winning book. And it was partly that work that made me realize that we really wanted to welcome Iram to one of our early presidential roundtables as well. And so, in a way, we have Iram's wisdom in at least 2 places for BERA, 2 really important places. So, without further ado, I would just like to say, Iram, you're very welcome. We will work with the technology, but I'm sure all will be well. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dom. I do hope that the right things are showing because I can't see the chat box at the moment. If there's a problem, please let me know audibly. Thank you very much, Dominic, for the introduction, but also to BERA for giving me the opportunity to present some research, and research that is particularly close to my heart, around social mobility and around the issue of children who are at risk, and in particular, the study of children who succeed against the odds. We really need to understand why some children succeed while others fall behind, so that we can make that happen for many more children. In particular, I'd like to thank my EPPSE colleagues. I'm drawing on a lot of the quantitative data that we collected as principal investigators for 17 years. But this sub-study draws mainly on the work conducted by myself and Professor Siraj Mayo during the sub-study. So this evidence, is based on trajectories of children that we followed for many, many years, 2,500 children from the age of 3 right through their learning life course. We studied their homes and their neighbourhoods and their schools. We all know that disadvantaged children generally do less well at school compared to their more advantaged peers in GCSEs, in English and maths, and there are poorer levels of achievement at the end of primary school in literacy and numeracy. However, we also learned, and particularly from longitudinal studies, that some children from disadvantaged backgrounds do succeed. And this sub-study, called the Child and Family Case Studies, explored this particular phenomenon. Halfway through our study, we were looking at performance in relation to expectations. And Ted Meliush did some work with us on how children, despite similarities in demographic backgrounds, there were still variations in educational pathways through the Learning Life course. And some of these students exhibited positive pathways despite adverse conditions. And others, the ones who continue to flounder, we seem to know more about. And we produced statistical attainment models as a function of child, family, neighbourhood. And the models were identifying individuals and groups who were attaining higher than expected, given their group position, as expected, or lower than expected. So, for instance, working class children who were doing much better than expected, as expected, failing, and even lower than expected, and similarly for other social classes. And we did allow for the effects of child, family, and neighbourhood factors. We have a whole report on that, but what differentiates being in an improving high group from a declining group seem to be three aspects that influence trajectories. The early years and, in fact, later home learning environment, the preschool effectiveness and primary school effectiveness. And this contributes to the debate on trajectories across the Learning Life course. Our theoretical background, I will come in and out of that for us because, you know, in the book that we have drawn on literature from a range of disciplines, but we settled on using as our theoretical framework the ecological model of human development by Urie Bronfenbrenner and his colleagues, because we were beginning to understand that children's development takes place in a nested structure, you know, with proximal factors of the home and the school going into wider aspects of society that influence and relationships. And we wanted to focus in particular on the proximal processes because we were looking at trajectories initially of children in the first 11 years. We then added further years and assessments as we went through the study. In particular, proximal processes are important because they function as a mechanism through which educational success is transmitted from one generation to the next. And I was particularly interested in how we could disrupt some of those mechanisms, or at least how we could understand how some children had disrupted those mechanisms and some families had to break out of those intergenerational patterns. And as Dom said, this presentation draws heavily on that work. And there is a book. I am going through several years of work in an hour's presentation, and it seems that you can go and read some aspects of this in your library. The sub-study is based on 50 children who were interviewed when they were aged between 13 and 16. Their families were interviewed and some of their teachers, and we wanted to understand how their trajectories were influenced. So we'll look at these 50 case studies and what we found. I'll tell you a little bit about the background, research questions, design. I want to say a little bit about the mixed iterative methodology because I have quite a strong view that in longitudinal studies, if you use mixed methods, you get stronger meta inferences. So it's not just associations, but you can begin to understand some causal relationships as well. And then we'll look at briefly at the findings because there are rather a lot of findings. So just a reminder that the bioecological model of influences really looks at the context, you know, the structures closest to the child, the family, the school, the neighbourhood, and in particular, the interactions between these microsystems, which would be family and, you know, teacher and parent. And we're also concerned with time because we're looking at the Learning Life course through a child's education and how that influences. and I'll come back to that. To a certain extent, we felt the need to really look at the literature around risk and resilience, because partly it's been written about in different ways, and partly because in education we use it slightly differently from the field of psychiatry and psychology. So you can see what we think resilience is. It's regarded as the adaptive process outcome which follows from the cumulative effect of protective factors when facing adversity or risk. And most of us know what protective factors would be: stimulating early home learning environment, parental involvement with school, expectations and high quality. And risk factors we know also are poverty, low parent education, SES and so on. Resilience in our study we've defined as a working definition children's attainment in English and maths at age 11. So for low SES families, if there's above predicted attainment, we would call that overachievement. And in terms of risk and vulnerability, we looked at the actual attainment at English and maths at 11, and then as we were interviewing, the children were growing, and we were able to add their attainment at 13 and 14 as well. So the research questions were to look at which factors act as protective influences and which increase the risk of poor outcomes. So we wanted to know what the key factors were within families that shape the educational and developmental outcomes of resilient and vulnerable children. We wanted to know what role the school and their teachers played in promoting a child's academic and social potential. And we wanted to know which factors external to school and family the families perceived as influencing children. We wanted to do this through the data that we had, but reflecting it back to the families themselves. We wanted the views of vulnerable and resilient children and their parents about their educational achievements and how they perceive the events and people that shape them. Going back to the bioecological model of human development, we know that development is a phenomenon of continuity, and this extends over the life course or the learning life course, which is what we were looking at, through historical time, both past and present. So for these youngsters, past and present was between the ages of 3 and 13 or 3 and 16. And we know that the influences change over time. So for instance, a child whose mother dies at 6, being studied at 6 would, that would be a very huge life event. But when the child is 13, that life event might have a lesser or reduced impact in that child's life. So we wanted to look at the complexity of development over time. Bronfenbrenner went on to really develop his model, and in around 2006, he worked with Morris to develop the PPCT, the person, resource, force and demand aspect of the model. So that is that the proximal processes look at the interactions between the child and their environment and the complexity of interactional support as well. In our work, we focused a lot on person and resource, and slightly less on force and demand, although they were there in the background and we did consider them. So we were looking at what children need developmentally and culturally to thrive. Our mixed method design, there was an iterative process. We used the quant data, the qual data, and went back and forth. And our first task was to do a multidisciplinary literature review related to what do we know already about social class, about children's achievement, and what are the aspects that influence children the most. And we created a semi-structured interview schedule to apply to every single child and every single family, knowing what we know about parenting, about children's development. And we created top-down qualitative analysis of the interview data as well. From the quant data, from the EPPSE 3 to 16, we took parent, child and teacher questionnaires, cognitive and social behavioural assessments, and we were able to use the quant data to develop these trajectories of those who were performing as expected, above, below, using multi-level modelling. For each child that we selected from their group, we created retrographs showing their achievement from age 3 at every point of assessment, which were at 3, 4, 6, 10, 11. And we provided questions for semi-structured interview schedules, and we created and analysed trajectories for rankings on English and maths. And I'll show examples of these in a bit. From the qual data, we had bottom-up qualitative analysis of the interview data, which was coded from the actual interviews, and that provided us with thick descriptions of individual case studies. I'm going to go through about 30 slides, but I've got 41. The ones I don't show you, but will be available if you get the PDF of the PowerPoint, have got all the anecdotal data from families. So a summary design is that we had a mixed method design with stronger inferences where we had an iterative relationship between findings. It was longitudinal and it was multidisciplinary. We drew on education, psychology and sociology in our book to really try and understand social class, children's achievement, and what schools and families do. The in-depth case study rationale was we used the quant data to look at factors impacting education and achievement trajectories of individuals, and the qualitative approach attempted to answer the why questions. Interestingly, although the DFE was asking a number of why questions, they were largely funding the quant data. And we didn't get funding for this research. In fact, I used quite a lot of my buyout funding to work with Aziza to get the data that we needed. And yet the findings from this study did seem to answer some of the questions that the DFE wanted answered. And right here, I would like to thank the DFE for funding all this work. For the most part, EPPSE was funded through the DFE. So the sampling, as I said, we used the multi-level modelling to get our sample from the full data. We controlled for child characteristics and family characteristics. The residual scores for each child indicated the differences between what they were predicted to get and their actual attainment. And then we had those groups of children. So there might have been, you know, I don't know, 260 children in the group that has low SES, high attainment, and we randomly selected children who we would ask to be in our study. And we ended up with 4 groups, basically a group that was low SES with high attainment, the ones that I had the most interest in. We had the low SES with predicted attainment, that is, that they were not achieving well, and high SES with low attainment. This is a group of middle-class children who weren't achieving as well as they predicted, and high SES who were achieving as predicted. So it's a very interesting sample of children. And our interview structure was that at the first level, there was an interview schedule which drew on all the literature and what we knew about our children and made up the majority of the questionnaire. And these questions were asked of all children and all parents and teachers. The second level were questions developed case by case based on each child's trajectory. And I'll show a trajectory in just a moment so you can see the kind of particular questions we might have asked. And then at the third level, these were determined during the interview as prompts and follow-ups, so we could get greater detail on the explanations the families were giving us. And this is just an interview coding procedure, because often qualitative researchers are criticised for not showing their workings out in the way statistical methods sometimes do. But we have a very thorough description in our book on how we sorted the data. And how we dealt with group events and experiences, and how we identified protective and risk factors, and how we coded perceptions about why and when students succeeded or not, measuring softly vulnerability. So here's an example of Stephen, and these are all pseudonyms, and this is how we worked. So this is a typical retrograph that we would have developed, looking at Stephen's achievements in English and maths at the beginning of the baseline, and then at the beginning of reception, end of reception, year 2, year 6, and year 9. And you can see that the whole group that represents Stephen's social class background has these trajectories here in English and maths, where the mean is 40. So that's where his peers are from his social class background. But Stephen himself has a trajectory where he starts off as low as other children in his group, but he ends up higher than his peer group in the same class. But we also see that at the end of reception, he was struggling in English, in reading in particular, but that overall he catches up over time. So we were able to ask him and his family particular questions about what happened around that period, what was going on in his life, what did the school do, what did the parents do, and so on. So the children from these 2 low SES groups, we've got Stephen here and a child from group 2, Patrick, who maintains the trajectory as expected and doesn't make a huge amount of progress in English and maths. Stephen, however, does, so he's in group 1. Stephen did go to a high quality preschool and is also summer born, but Patrick went to a medium quality preschool but is also summer born. What interests me about this graph is that the direction of ranking progressions versus regressions, a strong majority of children who succeed against the odds in group 1 and children from high SES backgrounds who performed according to prediction over time progressed in their rankings. And for the children from disadvantaged backgrounds, what interested me was that they often made gains in the first few years of primary school, up to, reception, the end of reception, year 1, but were never able to maintain that. Sorry, I've got to go back, and went downwards again, and were not able to maintain that lead that school gave them. So primary school for children, particularly the transition period into primary school gave gains, but during their junior years, they tended to fall back. And there are, we can speculate about why that might be. Maybe there is less practical work. Maybe the tasks in maths and language become more disembedded with teachers using more difficult language. We can speculate about that quite a bit, but I'd like to see more studies done on why that happens. And in our trajectories, in English and maths, for all the groups, The population change period seemed to be between preschool and the end of Key Stage 1. So that, to me, indicates that early interventions are really, really, really important. So in chapter 4 of our book, we looked at the cultural repertoires of child rearing across and within social classes. And we had these 50 case studies of children from 3 and 4 to 14, 15, 16. And we thought in one of our chapters, which people seem to enjoy the most because it really takes a child from each of those categories, like Tom, low SES and low academic achievement, Marcy, high SES and low academic achievement, and what actually happened to them through their learning life course. I'll give an example of Stephen again, because we've homed in on Stephen. I can't give you all the other examples because we would run out of time. In the early years, Stephen, at the age of 2-3, was described by his mother as active and aggressive, and they later learned that he had hearing difficulties as well. And after some surgery, his communication and self-regulation skills improved. His mother said basically he started to follow routines, talk more, and he learned to read books in the coming years. In primary school, his reading and maths skills were delayed. However, often after reviewing his reading, writing and maths, he was put into a special class for 9 weeks where they did quite a lot of physical activity and then quite a lot of work around language and early reading. And his work and attitude improved significantly during those 9 weeks. It ended up that by the end of primary school, he absolutely loved reading. In his secondary years, he managed to maintain a high academic achievement despite the fact that his parents divorced. He continued to play games, watched cartoons, talked to his best friends, also with high academic achievement, who stimulated his intellectual curiosity. In terms of Stephen's future, you can see that from what he liked and talked about, he had high aspirations. But what's relevant, and these factors came across the cases, even the low achieving, the middle class children who were low achieving against expectations, but they often then had a rise in secondary school because their parents were persistent with them, and many of them also had early interventions. Now, Stephen did have that early intervention class, and his mother put, and he did, a lot down to that base catch-up when he needed it. Also, his home environment, Mum created a strong home learning environment, even though her own educational background was poor. She spent time with Stephen and provided him with opportunities to speak, read. They went to the library, helped with his schoolwork, or found other people that could help him. And she spent the small amount of money she had on music and dance classes to try and boost his confidence. In terms of outings, she focused on free things like historical sites and museums. They lived in London. And she provided a great deal of encouragement and emotional support. The whole issue of encouragement and emotional support keeps coming up. It came up in the preschools, in early home learning environments. It came up amongst teachers in primary schools, and it certainly comes up in homes, parents who are able to emotionally support their children. So the emerging themes from on perceptions from the bottom-up analysis of the qualitative data. Now, I am summarizing a couple of chapters of work here. So in terms of the child, their perceived ability, interestingly, for vulnerable children, the perceived ability was seen to be natural, that there was nothing you could do about it. You know, parents often said things like, oh, I was like her or him when I was little. I didn't get on at school. I didn't like reading. You know, so it was just that's just the way things are. For children from disadvantaged backgrounds who their perceived ability was seen as malleable, that, if you gave them the chance, they might succeed, and you had to give them the opportunities, and you had to provide educational and emotional support. And they were provided with motivation, interests, and hobbies, and the families offered effective practical and emotional support and encouragement with schooling and learning. It's what we called in the book active cultivation. That's not to be confused with concerted cultivation that Annette Larreau talks about in her comparative study of middle class and working class families in the States, where the concerted cultivation even bordered on being a bit negative because there was so much pushiness by the parents. For us, active cultivation was where the parents had decided, and they often expressed that, the schools can't do everything for a child, that they have to support their children too, but that they often looked to the school to get help with that too, as well as providing it themselves. So this active cultivation of the child's emotions, their well-being, included things like being advocates for the children. When things weren't going well at school, they would, even though they were apprehensive of how the school would be, they went and stood up for their children at school and talked to the teachers and asked for additional support. In terms of the schools, the teachers we talked to and the parents we talked to and the children talked about teacher-sensitive responsiveness, their ability to be fair and authoritative, their interaction style that worked for them, and also sometimes supportive school policies. Interestingly, peers and friendships were very important to children. They looked for practical peer support, helping each other with their homework, buddying up, again, emotional support and motivation, particularly for the boys. They often talked about wanting to be a bit competitive with their peers. So that made us think about competition not always being a bad thing. And external environments to home came up frequently. So people's churches, mosques, relatives who offered emotional and practical support with school and learning from significant others, other family members. And again, risk factors, as you can imagine, are often the reverse of the protective factors. So in the peer environment, for instance, children complained about interferences with learning processes in class, and their own stimulating their own externalizing behavior problems. Higher levels, often parents complained of higher levels of ineffective teachers, higher levels of teacher turnover or supply teachers, and ineffective school policies. I want to move on to the implications for policy and practice, because I think this is something that we're all being tasked with to make our research more useful to the user group and for universities to be more meaningful in the research that they do to and with the people that they do it with. So I want to just hover a bit on the implications. This finding of active cultivation has implications for parenting programs and initiatives. As our study shows, that in these cases, the home as an institution is a very powerful proximal context over time. And this helps children to establish masterful learning dispositions towards school, even before they enter school, and stimulates the development of self-efficacy. And parents recognise and children recognise the school is also a strong proximal context, but it seems that in the early years, home is very powerful too, and that certainly primary schools and preschools cannot separate the two in terms of children's achievement. We also did a sub-study on NEETs. This was when our children were 17 to 23, and we found that many of the more vulnerable children who were then later diagnosed with things like ADHD or children who were caring for parents or had anxiety felt that they did not get support from their secondary schools in the way that they would have liked, and those children fell through the net. So school as a strong proximal context isn't just in the early years in primary. For children, it continues into secondary schools. And parents who showed active cultivation provided strong child-centered emotional support, which is sensitive to their children's developing needs. For example, a Bengali mother talked about how she started doing a GCSE in maths because when her child reached the age of 11, she could not keep up with the maths, so she decided to do a course herself. And obviously that was a great thing for the child to see, but it really showed how the active cultivation influenced the parent in what they had to do, what they felt they had to do to support their child. And often, in terms of emotional support, when parents talked about the children outgrowing them in their homework, they still provided a space for them to do their homework and ensured that they did their homework, and talked to them about it. So we could give you lots of examples, but there probably isn't time to do that. And even when they had difficulties, they offered persistent and consistent encouragement. So as children who succeed start school with a better grasp of school relevant skills and knowledge, there are implications for the early assessment of children entering school or preschool so that appropriate curriculum and pedagogy is personalised and adopted. I'm talking about diagnostic assessment here, some of which might be testing to identify children's strengths and weaknesses, but I'm not talking about things like the reception baseline assessment. And there is the importance, in terms of proximal factors, there is the importance of teachers in supporting and encouraging vulnerable children and avoiding negative expectations and stereotypes. Children often talked about things like this. And I think in terms of policy, it has implications for recruiting the best teachers into more disadvantaged schools. And although we have a pupil premium to support children and to support schools, often we don't have a teacher premium for teaching in disadvantaged schools. Many teachers who teach in more advantaged schools get their satisfaction from being with more motivated children, more motivated teachers. And I question, where is the motivation for teachers to teach in disadvantaged schools? Many of them are heroic and want to do it, but there are many who have less incentive to work in such communities. And I think that's something we ought to be thinking very, very hard about. The importance of relationships with peers and friends, it's inevitable that if you talk to teenagers, they're going to talk about this. And this has implications for teachers in promoting communities of learning in classrooms, ensuring that children can begin to develop friendships and group working relationships, that students can take some responsibility for their own learning and those of others and work towards shared goals. Now, that depends a lot, again, on the skill of the teacher and the climate that the school creates and on the leadership's ability to create that sort of environment as well. I don't think we can underestimate the importance of additional support classes. I don't just mean, you know, where you take children out and do remedial or additional work with them. I mean that all the children who might have additional needs are identified early on, and individualized and group support can be provided for them, particularly in key stage 1, and probably earlier and later too. And also the importance of social and cultural capital. We hear an awful lot about the word gap in early years, and my colleague Catherine Snow often talks about it's not a matter of having a word gap, it's a matter of having knowledge of the world gap because of what literature and experiences can give you. I would go a step further and say it's actually a social and cultural capital gap that children have, and that in particular we need to provide young children with educational experiences of the world, practical experiences, experiences through books that would help them get greater social and cultural capital. It's interesting that despite some parents and children believing achievement is a fixed quality, I think our study shows it's more cyclical. It's dependent on proximal processes and mediated by others in life. Our more successful children at risk were told that they were capable, were told that they could do things. And this was repeated over and over again by the parents when they were 3, 4, 5. And then when they went to school, it was repeated by their teachers. And this seemed to motor the children's motivation and well-being to achieve. The other children who were told that it was fixed, you know, that they weren't doing well, may have had those things reinforced in school too. So I want to just end with this quote by Slavin. Given the potential for developmental protection, what is the potential for successful interventions? And even more critically, post-pandemic, what can we do to support our children to achieve? And this may all seem like it's obvious in this quote, but it can't be obvious, can it? Because often we're not doing it. The prevention of school failure through the primary schools or elementary grades for most disadvantaged children can be assured through the implementation of effective birth to 3 interventions, effective preschool and kindergarten programs, and effective curriculum and instruction in the elementary grades, combined with support services for those children who need them. So I think those people who are working in the field of school improvement, school effectiveness, do know that effectiveness makes a difference. And, you know, for those of us that know about the James Heckman equation, the economist who talks about intervention under 5 being the biggest and best investment the governments can make, know that the equation is complex, that we know that you get a bigger bang for your buck if the intervention is for more disadvantaged children. You get a bigger bang for your buck if you go birth to 3 compared to 3 to 5. And I think this all has implications for how we support children to embark on their learning life course and whether that journey will be successful or not. Thank you very much for listening. I've got a little bit more time, so I think I probably can go into some of the additional illustrative findings that look at progress up to early secondary age, which defies the odds of disadvantage. I've got some slides which I will put up because if there's just a recording for you to rely on, you might want to come back to these and look at them. And these are basically illustrative quotes from children, parents, and sometimes teachers, showing how the children and parents explained what was happening to them. So if we had the finding that it requires effort, determination, and active participation from the children themselves, as well as from the people around them, you've got some examples there. Charlene's teacher says the fact that she's doing so well is kind of a tribute to her, a deep down motivation, I think, which she has. She goes on, Stephen, who you now know, his mother says, he's just got the drive in him. He's got this natural ability as well for maths and sciences, but he's got this drive. He wants to be the best at everything that he puts his hand to, and he's not happy unless he is. And so the more he's trying, the more he gets better. The exam results coming in, and he's getting in the 80s and 90s. He's like, yes, and that drives him on. So the emotional and practical support that we talked about, Charlie's mother says of her, she was a very active child, very active, and she was always keen to learn things, and she was always quick to pick up on things. My mum and dad, they're always praising her up, and they're always saying to her, you know, you do well at school, and you know, if they've got a problem on the computer, they always ask Charlie, because she can just do it like that. So yeah, everybody encourages Charlie, really. And we have other examples. Again, stimulated in homes where parenting is a process of active cultivation that facilitates and nurtures children's cognitive and social. Martha, low SES, high attainment. Because we didn't have a lot of, this is her mother, because we didn't have a lot of money, so we made things. We used to make all sorts. We used to walk up to the city and walk the parks, and we used to do art stuff, didn't we? We used to make a lot of things, anything out of nothing. We made this big doll's house out of toilet roll and glue and cardboard. We had this big cardboard box. So what you can see is these parents, they don't have much money, but they're spending time with their children. They're talking, they're making learning fun, and they're not using many resources. Aisha, again, she's a girl, low SES, high attainment. I learned like what school was, and maybe they helped me with my work we were doing in school before, like doing, like just so we can have a bit of a better understanding. So it's not like totally new to them, because then like you're going to school, and if you learn so many things new at the same time, you don't get them all. So we've got, again, children nurtured through good or excellent quality preschools, particularly for boys. We found that more of our low SES boys who had high achievement went to high quality preschools, a very high number of them, compared to the girls who seemed to be more resilient to lower quality in preschool. But the boys who achieved as expected, that is failed, seem to have been to lower quality preschools. So we don't have the evidence, but it does make you, it begs the question whether boys, working class boys, need a particular pedagogy. Are they more sensitive to quality? I think we have to ask those questions ourselves. And children, again, who were stimulated by teaching strategies that allowed the students to bond with the teachers and to enjoy lessons. And Shakil here is talking about Miss MacDonald, who he seems to get on very well with, and who he feels supports his work. And again, we've got children here themselves telling us what they liked about school, you know, that teachers can be strict, but if they're calm and relaxed and they don't criticize, and so on. And practical classes, because I like to get involved in doing things. And they were stimulated where schools help children to deal effectively with difficulties through additional classes. Angeli says the only subject that I ever really struggled in was maths. That was like my weak point, but going to the booster classes, it really made me enthusiastic about maths more. So the more I did it, the more I got used to it. Now it's like a routine. If I find something difficult, like in maths, I'll look it up and then I'll read over it again until I understand. And, you know, we ask Anjali further questions, and she supports the view that booster classes intervention really helped her. And coming to the end, stimulated by peers who offered positive role models and sometimes friendly competition. We'll look at Stephen again because we know a little bit about him. They do help me quite a bit. I mean, as I said, Elmer is the one who likes to read a lot. He seems to be sort of naturally gifted in pretty much every subject, and like A and A star and everything. It sort of made me work harder and harder because sort of reach his level, and he always seems to sort of rise to it. So I always have to keep up with him. And again, supported by social networks in the wider community, the social and cultural capital these networks provide to parents and children. So children talking about their auntie and uncle and how dad's brothers help and how they get support from other family members. And Rihanna's mother also talks about how brownies and sea cadets really helped. Rihanna liked to try everything. She tried the dancing and she got bored. She tried the modern dancing, she got bored. She went to brownies as well. She was a brownie. She got bored. If she sees something, she wants it. I want it now. I'm always trying to get her to look at what she can gain from it, whether it's going to take commitment, because if something takes commitment, she's not very good at commitment over a long basis. That's what amazes me about the Sea Cadets, because the Sea Cadets involves discipline, commitment, all the things that she shies away from. The Sea Cadets demands it of her, and she does it, even though she comes home and moans and moans and moans at me. So finding things for children that they can persist at, that they can commit to, that would possibly give them that growth mindset is something that some of these parents did. I'm going to go back to the questions and ask Don to take over. I'm not sure if I have to do something now, but...
Thank you, Iram. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Brilliant. Well, I'll get to the questions in a moment. First of all, I can see you talking, but can't hear you at the moment. Looks like we've got a slight problem. Right. Iram.
If somebody's question doesn't get answered, my email is there. If anyone would like to email me, I'm very happy to respond.
Thank you. There was a little blip there, but I think we're both live again now. So can I just say thank you so much for really stimulating and important keynote talk. 3 things stuck out for me, and then I'll get quickly to the questions because we've got about 10 lined up, which I've sort of curated, as they say. So I think for me that your comment about where is the teacher premium for teaching in disadvantaged areas was a crucial observation. So thank you so much for that one. I was also interested in this idea of the word gap versus the knowledge of the world gap, and also the idea about the importance of intervention before children are 5 or even before they're 3. Crucial things, I think, for all of us, including policymakers. But let me now, I'm going to take the questions in order of, largely in order of the ones as they came in. So this first one came in 20 minutes ago, and it's from Lucy Wenham. She says, brilliant, important workbook keynote. Thank you so much. Question, I am fascinated by the most marginalized whose parents may not be available for interviews. Did your work include anyone in care, for example? How can such sustained deep work access these most vulnerable students too?
I think that, I mean, it's not a study that looked at absolutely everything. I've this morning had a meeting with our team from Bath and here that have got a Medical Research Council grant to look at the mental health of children who are care experienced from the age of 10 to 25. The Rees Centre here at Oxford has done an enormous amount of work with that age group, so I would recommend that you look at their website. There are wonderful reviews and wonderful studies that have interviewed those children. We ourselves will be trying to look at the mechanisms of resilience and transition across that learning life course from 10 onwards. But no, we didn't have a large proportion of looked after children, but we would say that there is a continuum for children in need compared to young care experienced children. And many of our children would have been defined as children in need. And certainly the NEAT study that I led on had many children that would have had those sorts of similar issues to children in care. But yes, we need specific interviews and support and findings from those groups. And I think my colleagues at the Rees Centre here are contributing to that, as our colleagues at Bristol and Cardiff and various other universities looking into important work like this.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move to another question, Iram, if that's okay. I'm aware that on one of our tabs, there's a delay in the video, so you may be experiencing the same thing. So there's another question. Oh, by the way, I just wanted to add that the BERA Presidential Roundtable on Children's Mental Health and Wellbeing, the report's been published. This was led by Professor Jane Hurry. Yes. People may also be interested in that. Anyway, next question is from Brittany Wright. Thank you so much for sharing this fascinating and important research. I've ordered your book and can't wait to read it. Out of interest, were there any children in your study who were from low SES backgrounds and who overachieved, but whose parents did not engage in, quote, active cultivation? If so, what factors were seen as crucial to their success?
I think they didn't. Sometimes they didn't engage in active cultivation educationally, but they all engaged in active cultivation in terms of children's emotional support. So they talked to them about their feelings and, you know, so basically they had somebody there watching their back and being there for them. And maybe, I don't know, we can't answer that question conclusively, but I suspect that many of those parents helped them make sense of what was happening in their home, in their life. And maybe that accounts for, we can't be certain, maybe that accounts for less chaos, you know, and more predictability, more stability. And maybe that's important to children. Maybe that sense of emotional protectiveness is an underlying, you know, component to how we feel about learning. But I think all the parents offered something. It seemed to me that it seemed to be a combination of what the parents did, which was the most powerful, but also what the peers did and what the teachers did. So there were parents that were less actively cultivating, but then the children often explained it through teachers and peers. But how that formula works, whether there's a perfect formula, I don't know, because so much depends also on the motivations and the personality of the child as well.
Yeah, I think thank you very much for the question and for the answer. One final question, I think, then we must finish. So this one is from Stephanie King. Thanks for a really interesting presentation. Could you talk a little about how much you see schools as being able to mitigate for factors such as poverty? How important is the question of child poverty to this conversation? Or can schools who take on this learning do enough to level the playing field?
I don't know if they can level the playing field, but I think they can do a much better job than we're doing at the moment. I think many schools are doing a fabulous job in this area. So when I talk to my colleagues like Cassie Buchanan or others who have schools in challenging areas, their children's performance is fantastic. And what's interesting is that they not only emphasize the curriculum, like literacy and maths, it's often embedded within a strong emotional and well-being context for children. So I think the climate in which children learn is as important as what they learn. So many people prioritize curriculum content and knowledge and pedagogical content knowledge, and so they should. And others will prioritize social emotional climate and pedagogy. But actually, it makes sense from the child's point of view that you need both. And some children will need more than that. So the baseline is that we ought to have schools that support all children, but that some children will need extra effort and support by teachers to maybe compensate for some things that they're not getting elsewhere. And, you know, it's the old Bernsteinian thing. Education cannot compensate for society in the sense that we can't do anything about poverty, but we can do something about social and cultural capital. We can do something about the quality of the experience in the school hours, and we can do something about interventions. So I think you're right. Poverty has a huge impact, but it's not insurmountable to offer some protective factors for that particular risk factor.
Iram, thank you so much. As ever, a truly memorable experience and so much that I've learned. And I know that the constant stream of questions as the audience have been really engaged. I'm just sorry that we couldn't get to everyone's questions. Fascinating for us all to end, I think, on political questions around poverty. I had an email today from the Nuffield Foundation, yes, where they produced a report that apparently shows
poverty is up.
Yes, that since this government actually started, that child poverty has gone much worse. And so I think there's quite right. There's a limit to what teachers themselves and schools can do, and that limit's important, isn't it? Because literally they can't solve all the problems of the world. But I think our policymakers do have serious questions to answer about child poverty worldwide, let alone in England and the UK. So but it's an issue that, of course, is perennial to some degree, but also arguably very, very pressing in the times we're living in. So, Iram, wonderful. Thank you. Audience, thank you. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and it's goodbye from me for now.
Thank you.